Welcome to Tech Pulse, the 2020 launch of the TIN report. Today's our third day and today's first session, the first of three. We're looking at spending trends and the evolution of R&D funding. So we're going to be talking about the investment in innovation and the various incentives that can promote that. It's an important subject. Last year, growth in R&D spending for the 200 TIN companies grew by 10% to a record 1.5 billion. That's essentially 12% of total revenue. So innovation and market leadership is a key part of why the TIN companies have been so successful in continuing their double-digit growth. And we're very honoured to have today the Honourable Dr. Megan Woods, who's the Minister for Research, Science and Innovation. Dr. Woods comes from an academic and business and science background. She was the business manager for Plant and Food. She's got a PhD in history and is the MP for Wigram. So welcome, Dr. Woods. Thanks for taking time out of your day today to speak to us.
My pleasure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Wonderful. So, look, sorry, I didn't have problems getting on the platform. I just like to reassure everybody of that. I just got held up on a phone call. But do you want me to just leap in with some comments, Greg? Is that where you...
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Look, thank you so much for inviting me along to talk to you all this morning, and great that we can get together in this forum. I'd really like to congratulate you on the launch of the Technology Investment Report for 2020. I think it's great to see some of those things coming through, so congratulations to Greg, to you and all the team that made that happen. And I'm really also pleased to see that the sector has continued some strong growth through what has been an extraordinarily challenging year for all of us. I think if any of us had sat here last year and thought about what the year coming might bring, none of us could have even in our wildest dreams imagined what was about to happen. So one of the things that I am very pleased to be able to talk to you about today is the government's investment in innovation and in R&D, and how we see this in terms of how we recover and the shaping of New Zealand. We want to create a modern New Zealand that we can be proud of, a better New Zealand for generations, for this generation and for those to come behind us. And that requires measuring success in new ways, going beyond GDP to ensure the health and resilience of our people and to see businesses, regions and the environment thrive. So you would have heard ministers and the Prime Minister talk a lot about our goal is to generate productive, sustainable and inclusive growth. That is very much the vision as we see it. It's an ambitious goal. We are under no illusions about that. And it requires us to increase our investment in new knowledge and innovation that will diversify our economy, create high-value jobs, and importantly, help the transition to a lower emissions economy and build our resilience against future crises. And obviously, tech is absolutely central to this vision. We're committed to tackling those long-term challenges, promoting job growth, supporting small businesses to succeed, and to position New Zealand globally as a great place to do business. And we know that R&D is central to achieving all of these aims. It is R&D that will help create high-value, high-tech jobs and unlock growth for us in new areas. So one of the things in the RS&I portfolio, and as ministers, I want to help smart Kiwi businesses innovate and the tech sector to thrive. We've made several investments in R&D, such as the R&D tax incentive program. We are doing progressively doing the rollout of that now, and I'm determined that we get those settings right so that we're fulfilling what the purpose of that $1 billion in funding, which is to be supporting our businesses to do the R&D that they choose to do. And then we've also had our more recent government initiatives in response to the COVID-19 recovery. One of the things that we are absolutely adamant of, and I've been passionate about, is that we do put in place some support so that we don't see a retreat from R&D as conditions get more and more challenging, that we've got support there for businesses to continue to do R&D. We saw in our post-COVID budget that we actually put more money into R&D. So kind of wanting to lead by example, that when the going gets tough, the R&D budget isn't the first thing that gets slashed. And I think that that's really important. So we've got the R&D tax incentive program there to go, but we've also got the R&D loan scheme, which was introduced as a direct response to COVID to help R&D intensive businesses to maintain or accelerate R&D. The scheme has been very popular and the loan funds have been very quickly taken up. So it was great to see when we set up a loan that could only be accessed for R&D that we did see businesses taking up. So these are a couple of ways in which the government is supporting business innovation to help grow and scale New Zealand's R&D capability and better position New Zealand globally. We're also committed to increasing funding for the Innovative Partnerships program. And I think this has been an incredibly important program that is really starting to ease the way not only for investment in New Zealand, but for some innovative New Zealand tech companies to do things. I went to the launch of Kia Aerospace earlier this week in Innovative Partnerships, and the work that we've been doing around the regulation with the CAA was allowing them to do their testing. And that's a New Zealand-based company. But within that Innovative Partnerships program, we've attracted 14 firms to invest in New Zealand, including Whisk, who are developing a fleet of autonomous electric air taxis, and Leo Labs, a global leader in space debris tracking. So as well as the ongoing work in the RS&I portfolio, we've also kicked off ambitious pieces of work to create an industry transformation plan for the digital technology sector. And that's been led through the economic development portfolio with my colleague Stuart Nash leading that work. And we have work streams in areas like New Zealand's tech and innovation story, data-driven innovation and development of a national AI strategy, so we can design specific initiatives and make a material difference to the sector's growth. So in summary, the government wants New Zealand to be known as a global innovation hub and a world-class generator of new ideas for a sustainable and productive future. Through RS&I, we can achieve our goals and invest in New Zealand's future, a future that looks after our children, creates rewarding employment opportunities, protects our environment and social well-being, and transitions us to carbon neutrality. And I hope you enjoy the upcoming virtual networking session, and thank you for inviting me to speak.
Awesome. Thanks, Honourable Dr. Woods. Really appreciate you making the time to be here today. And as as I'm involved in a company who are a recipient of some of those schemes that you've mentioned, obviously very grateful for the COVID-19 period. So following on from Dr. Woods, we're going to have another doctor, Dr. Tim Bembo, who's EY's Oceania partner for government incentives. And I think Dr. Woods, you possibly know Tim. He's on the advisory panel for incentives. And Andrew Morby, who's EY's Oceania Director for private client service and transactions. So before we get into discussion, a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the session, go to the questions tab and send them through. We'll be asking Brendan at the end of the session. We'll be fielding some of those questions. So if you want to contact anyone who's on this call, for anyone, including Dr. Woods, go into anyone who's been at any of the events, and we've pretty much had the who's who of the tech sector here over the period of time. You can send them a message and make contacts. The idea of this package, swap card, is not only to have these kind of one-way or two-way conversations, but for people to be able to network and make connections. So either through the networking tab or the TinTech Showcase. If you're confused about any of the functionality, there's a 90-second video. If other issues, reach out to Marinka, Bettina, any one of the TIN team if you want any help. Now, don't forget, Today is I think the last day that you can get a 20% discount on the tin report. So if any of you just want to go online immediately, I won't apologise for you looking at the screen and ordering your report. You don't need to be shy about that. Or any tech companies here today who aren't a tin member, please join. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Tim and Andrew to take you through today's session. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thanks, Greg. And thanks for the opportunity on behalf of Tim and myself to present here. It's a great initiative you've got going, and we're proud to be part of it. As Greg articulated at the beginning, the purpose of what we're trying to achieve here and the discussion is to talk around the evolution of R&D, how it's affecting our businesses, what's changing, or what has changed in the next few years, what we expect to change, and then linking that into the funding opportunities that Megan Woods talked about. So first of all, we're just going to do a little presentation around Tim's going to do a little presentation on our thoughts and the trends as we see them at the moment. So just over to you, Tim.
Yeah, perfect, Andrew, and morning, everybody.
Excellent.
So just want to start this morning by running through some of the trends that we've seen in R&D funding over the recent past in New Zealand. My exposure to R&D funding in the business sense actually goes back to the early 2000s when I was at Otago University, and I ended up doing my PhD in connection with a startup business out of Otago Uni, which received funding from Forced back in the day. And that actually paid me to do my PhD, and as a result commercialised the technology that we were developing and then commercialising as part of my thesis. But we won't go quite back to early 2000s to look at funding today. If we jump onto the next slide, we're looking at probably over the last 8 or 10 years in New Zealand, and apologies for the size of it. But I guess that the first message is that New Zealand businesses are increasing R&D funding, and what they're spending on R&D over the last 8 years. It's increased from around 1.2 to $2.4 billion. And interesting, Greg, when you opened, you were saying out of the tin companies, that's 1.5 billion was reported in the 20 year for R&D spend by tin businesses. So that's a really significant part of the total R&D expenditure in New Zealand by businesses. There's a breakdown of the 2019 data presented by industries and sectors, and that aligns with the data that you shared for tin companies there. And the thing that I'm really encouraged by is the real recent growth in R&D expenditure is in the technology space, in the computer science, computer services, digital services space. Interestingly, in the recent years, there has been a drop-off in the primary sector in R&D, as you'll see from the data. But it's interesting, the classification of that, because I'd imagine a lot of digital services that feed into the primary sector are probably caught within the services and the technology space rather than being presented in the primary sector. So it's probably a transition from traditional primary sector R&D to more digital-enabled primary sector R&D. If we jump to the next slide, so that's New Zealand business spend on R&D. This slide here represents how New Zealand businesses fund their R&D. So what we find is that consistently over the last 8 years, that New Zealand businesses have been funding about 75% of the R&D out of their own pocket. So they are investing their own funds to do R&D in New Zealand out of profit or out of capital that they have raised as a business. There's a couple of other categories there. We see the contribution from the New Zealand government primarily in grants during this period, consistently sits at about 11% of that funding. So the government contribution for funding in 2009 was 280 million, but of that 11 or 12%, The majority of that, about 70% of that, is tied to the Callahan Innovation Growth Grants, which most people on the call will know that that is the program that is being transitioned over the last 18 months, and by the end of March next year will be definitively ceased, and it's being transitioned to the R&D tax incentive that the Minister mentioned before. A couple of other interesting categories in the data is overseas. So overseas contribution to New Zealand R&D, effectively on a cost plus arrangement for global associates of New Zealand businesses, is about equivalent to the amount invested in R&D by the government of New Zealand, so around that 11%. And then there's some other funding sources, primarily contract R&D, that gets presented there. So the takeaways I see from this is New Zealand government's contribution is consistent around that 11-12% of R&D funding. But I guess the risk for government is that that is very heavily weighted to one pool of funding, which is the growth grant program, which is being discontinued. So something to note, and many of the businesses on this call will be aware, is this data is direct grant or incentive funding. It doesn't cover things like the R&D loss tax credits, which is a refund of carry forward tax losses that would otherwise be carried forward. So in the 2019 year, there was $43 million of tax losses that were refunded rather than the businesses carrying forward. So that's a real cash flow assistance for New Zealand businesses as a result of R&D. If we jump onto the last slide that I want to talk about, and it's more around the landscape of New Zealand funding. Of that 11%, what does that look like? And there are a number of different programs, and I've just included a snapshot here of some of those programs. There are lots more. There's lots of smaller pockets of funding that's available from government to help businesses do R&D. There's the grant programs, there's the Callahan project grants, there's student grants, experience grants, fellowship grants. There's the growth grants program that's been continued or discontinued. And then there's a whole range of other competitive grants, which tend to be more industry-focused, industry-specific, where the government is choosing to differentially invest. The second set of funding sources are tax incentives. This is the R&D loss offset, which I mentioned before, the $43 million that was paid out in 2019. And then there's the new R&D tax incentive that's coming in from the 1920 income year. There is another tax structure or tax incentive that's available, and it has a slightly different focus, but it's something that a number of New Zealand businesses have absolutely benefited from, is the ability to defer R&D deductions as well. Within tax, or the companies can choose if they're going to recognise tax deductions. The purpose of this law is to enable companies to defer deductions through an event which would otherwise cause them to lose those tax losses. If they had recognised them and there's a change in control and they'd lose the losses, this enables them to preserve those losses through a transaction. It was specifically set up to help growth businesses where tax losses are of little value and there's a high likelihood that they would be lost because of capital raises in the future. So that's a really valuable incentive that is available to businesses and has been for a number of years. The final one I've mentioned here is the R&D loan scheme. Minister Woods mentioned the loan scheme. It's had really high uptake, and there was $150 million allocated to this program, and I believe the majority of that has been allocated, although there may be more funding coming for that in the future. The interesting thing is of all these grants and incentives, each of them have a slightly different focus. Each of them are applicable to different businesses in their life cycle, in their development phase. But what we do see is a general rule, where there is higher risk and a lower likelihood of return to R&D, the government funding is higher. So the pure university type research, the government funds university level research effectively 100%. Directly in the public sector. To encourage businesses to do that high risk, lower likelihood of return R&D, that's where some of these one-to-one match funding programs come in. As we reduce the risk of R&D, then the R&D funding rates tend to drop. So the growth grant programs or the tax incentives where there's 15 to 20% funding available. So there is a direct correlation between risk and likely return to the business and the contribution that the government's willing to make through these different programs. So that's a bit of a snapshot of the programs that are available. As I say to any business that I'm talking to around R&D, we don't want to go chasing pools of money, government funding to help your R&D. I've seen a few businesses do that over the years, but where the funding's available and it aligns with what you're doing commercially and where you're wanting to go, then it's absolutely worth pursuing and using these, leveraging these as much as possible to help R&D in the business. Andrew, back to you. Or Greg.
Thanks, Tim. I just want to say for us, with as many of you will know, I'm involved in the medical device startup, and the R&D incentives and tax loss credits and the loan schemes have been really essential or critical for us over COVID-19. So if any companies aren't engaged in that process or it all looks too hard, I'm sure you guys are smarter than that, but I'd strongly advise you look at it, and I have to say that Tim and the team have worked with us and been very, very helpful and pragmatic. And cash is king. In uncertainty, obviously, you want to make sure you've got cash. And I've been amazed at just for the whole TIN universe, the governance around balance sheets and cash over this period of time has been incredibly professional. So now I'm going to shortly pass over to Andrew, who's going to lead a roundtable discussion on some of these issues. And we're very privileged to have today Graham Grant, Thibaut Caplain, Nick Gaddam and Don Oxley. Graham's the CEO of Seequent. He's not a neighbour of Megan Woods. I just asked him before if they'd crossed paths. Thibaut's the Executive GM for Daifuku. Nick's the Chief Scientific Officer for DEC or DSC. And Don is the VP Product Self-Service Technology at Daifuku also. So, Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Greg. I should say as well, I mean, this is an open mic session, so whilst we've got some people kind of primed up and prodded to offer some views, anyone on the call, as long as you unmute yourself, you're welcome to join the discussion. So please feel free. So I guess before we'll start with kind of R&D spending and the trends in it, and then we'll kind of move on to the funding elements. So to start with, I guess I'm interested and within the businesses that Tim and myself see, we have noticed some changes in R&D spending over the COVID period. I guess it depends on the type of businesses that we're talking about, but I'd be interested from the views of the people here as to how over the past 6 months spending in R&D has changed, or if it has changed at all, compared to what it was for the previous 6 months. So maybe Graham, I might just ask you first if you want to kind of give some views from a Seequent perspective.
Thanks. So just for those on the call, I don't know how much you know of us. We tend to be a fairly low-profile company, but we have around 430 staff, of which closing on 200 of those would be in New Zealand, based here in Canterbury, which is our global HQ. And we have development centres. We're a pure play software business, just to be clear. So on this call, there'll be a lot of different businesses doing R&D in different modes and different end markets. So we're a pure play software business. So it's about software development that we ship to over 120 countries around the world in multiple end markets. So from our standpoint, like most businesses, we hit pause as we ran into the start of the COVID period because we're highly exposed to a number of multiple end markets, civil engineering, government, mining, and so forth. So we paused, and so you might say that caused somewhat of a slowing, but it was very modest. It ran for 3 to 4 months before we figured out pretty quickly that the markets would remain strong for our products, and we could defray any kind of those growth issues. I would say that the issues we have started to experience and we may experience, going forward, is around recruitment. In a software business, your R&D in this broadest definition is your ability to produce great product and deliver it to market. So there will be current questions and continuing questions over recruitment within, New Zealand Inc. And there are some subtleties around there. Staff working to residents. Will that continue? Is that going to be impacted by, border and immigration related issues, which, as most on the call would know, have been ratcheted up. More than half of our development staff here would not be, New Zealand nationals by origin, and so that's a very important issue for us. I can make some comments about the future, but that's the sort of current status.
Thanks, Graham. Nick, do you want to add anything to that in terms of your business?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. So we're quite a different company.
Nick, we can't hear you.
Just a bit louder.
How's that?
Yep,
That's better.
that's good.
Nick, can you also start, and the speakers just start, Graham, could you just briefly, before we go to Nick, just explain what Seequent does?
Sure. So we're developers of subsurface, effectively geological sciences software, and without dropping into all of what that means, essentially we help companies operating below the surface of the ground who need to make high value decisions. So that could be a mining company looking to extract gold. It could be LA City trying to understand the water movement underneath the city as it affects deformation or affects freshwater supply for that city. Or a more local example would be in Auckland with the new rail developments in the subsurface. The software has been used to help navigate the development of those tunnels by Auckland to make sure that they can deal with what are actually very highly uncertain ground conditions, because city's built on a volcano and you actually don't know what's underground, and that materially affects the safety, cost and reliability of the project delivery. So that's a kind of simple description.
So we're at DSC. We're quite a different company. We're principally a manufacturing company. We manufacture. We are a GMP manufacturer of pharmaceuticals and medical devices. We also do a lot of injection molding for regulated industry plastic parts. So for us, in terms of the impact of COVID, we also, similar to Grant, we took a very cautious approach at the beginning. I think that was across the board because we didn't have much of an idea of what was happening. We actually found that the effect of COVID was we had a bit of an upturn actually, due to the fact that we were supporting a lot of medical device companies and manufacturing parts for companies that would have increased demand. So there was that initial pause, probably lasted a couple of months, and then we just carried on business as usual in terms of carrying on the R&D programs that we have here.
Okay, thank you. Don or Thibaut from Daifuku?
Yeah, so Daifuku, we are a material handling company, so we play in warehouse environment, logistics, and airport baggage handling and services. So as you can imagine, the airport sector of our company has been hit significantly by COVID. So what happened is probably 2-3 months down the COVID line, even though from a software point of view, the outlook stays pretty constant. We had to clearly reduce the R&D spending for us to compensate for the impact on the other part of the business. So we're not a pure player. We're turnkey manufacturers and support services, etc. And these has been impacted. And unfortunately, one of the overhead we had to reduce is R&D. So pretty much almost divide by 2 totally over this year. That was the impact. Next year, though, I think we should be back to normal spending and try to catch up for what we haven't done this year. And that's going to be the tricky part for us.
Well, thank you.
And just to add to that, yeah. So obviously, the space I look at, just as mentioned earlier, is self-service on the aviation side. So we were obviously very impacted. We deal with usually clients which are focusing on passengers, so not other areas of aviation. So as soon as they are hit with passenger numbers, obviously we are hit. So as Thibaut's mentioning, we need to react quickly. I guess one of our benefits, perhaps in hindsight, was we actually had a project at Wuhan Airport of all places, so we were very aware of the situation very early on this year, and began acting accordingly. So I think that probably helped us reacting quickly, and Daifuku in general. But yeah, it's certainly been quite savage cuts to R&D to try and manage our expenditure.
Oh, thanks, Don. I guess just moving on, and one of the factors that we see is as the kind of funding streams for R&D come on and they require certain thresholds and certain processes to be performed. What we're noticing is that companies probably from about 5 years ago need to be a lot more disciplined on the processes for measuring R&D when they're starting new projects, and how they're measuring the cost and allocating those costs. I guess I'm interested from the group here as to how you go about managing how you go about with managing those processes. Is it something that's centralised with the finance team, or do you push it down to the individual project teams? So just a question around how you're managing your processes for capturing R&D spend. Nick, maybe you want to have a crack at that first.
Sure. I mean, we're in terms of New Zealand tech companies, I suppose we're kind of medium to large. We've got about 250 people here. Our R&D team is a small piece of that. The way that we manage the projects and manage the funding is really, it's a hand-in-hand operation between our finance team and our R&D team. So, budgets are decided on the year before and issued. And work plans are adjusted accordingly, and then we have a very careful eye on Gantt charts and milestones as we move through that work to make sure that those two are aligning, and regular checks every month. So there is a sort of a keen collaboration between finance and R&D to make sure that those numbers match up at the end of the year.
Has that changed over time? Has that improved over time, or what's the learnings been?
So it's changed over time, not so much from the main reason that it's changed over time has mainly been because our company has been changing over time. We've got some products that which are slow release, slow hormone release products that are used in the animal industry that we export to about 50 different countries around the world. And we manufacture about 8 million of these implants per year. And we've been doing that for about 20, 25 years. They're recently off patent, and so they've become mature products. And so now we see ourselves going back into that cycle of R&D and working with partners to bring new products in. So it's changed over time because the way that we do R&D is now changing as we move through that next cycle.
Okay. Graham, have you got anything to add there in terms of how it's changed at Seequent?
Just to be clear and link you back to the prior presentation, so we are still on the tail end of the Callahan process. So we are not currently in the R&D tax credit system, and we won't be until next year. So on that basis, the way we can monitor and manage that, because it's highly generalized, is very straightforward and done via the finance team. That process and method is consistent with what we are exposed to overseas. In Canada, for example, has the SHRED system, they call it, which is very advanced, is a significant pump primer of the Canadian economy, and it runs sort of very thematically similar to that. So we're looking into the whole question of R&D, and I guess we'll get onto that, maybe that topic a little later. So we've got particular views around that, but as it stands today, it's pretty straightforward for us. It won't be going forward.
Okay. Don and Thibaut, have you got anything?
Yeah, we are also in the Callahan growth, but we formed with the RST a long time ago and used a few project grants, so we now well oriented in how to manage this. But due to our business is very much R&D, traditionally was R&D on the job a lot, so that's forced a lot of the clarification of what is pure product development versus what is deployed at our customers. So if anything, that has forced us to clarify and structure our R&D stream as such, as opposed to just ad hoc. I'm talking way back when we were a bit younger company and not so organized, and I think now we've well oiled. I'm expect at the moment it's still very much at the R&D engineer level. We decide what's R&D and what is not, and then the finance team is structured behind so that we can report accordingly. We are going to transition to RTDI as well at the end of the year. We haven't really looked at it, but I suspect it's going to move away from the actual engineering team to more the finance team to figure this out. I'm not sure. I have to admit we get to get our heads around what RTDI is going to mean for us.
And I think, just adding on to that, Thibaut, I think from a management standpoint of R&D within Daifuku, I mean, perhaps we have somewhat of an advantage in the way that we're structured as a business. We are a project-based business, so everything that we do with our clients is set up in a project, and so the back-end reporting, finance reporting, etc. It's very easy for us, as Thibaut says now, for us to manage those R&D projects as projects within our business, which sort of, I think, enables our finance and back-end teams to report on that a little bit more easily than if we were just carving off the portion of the business that focused on R&D and it wasn't isolated within an R&D project per se.
Tim, I think it might be useful to just get a few comments from yourself. I guess all the companies here are transferring from a growth grant onto a tax incentive. What are we seeing? We've always been through a phase of seeing companies do that over the last couple of years. What are the hurdles that you see from that change, particularly around the processes?
Yeah, good question, Andrew. And I think Graham and Thibaut, everyone sort of indicated what the big changes are. It is a shift from almost an R&D structure type program to an activity-based program. So there is a lot of attention that needs to be given to specific activities and specific projects and into the detail. Interestingly, looking at the comment about the Canadian R&D tax incentive program or the UK or Australia, the legislation is really similar, but the way it's practically outworked in the detail that's required and how that operates, I think that's something that at the moment New Zealand's going very detailed, but as Minister Woods said earlier, her exact comments, they're determined to get the settings right. So I think that's something that is live and active at the moment with the government teams who are working on the incentive, but it is a work in progress. But there is definitely a change from the growth grant, really focused around defining activities, defining projects, and getting that understanding clear. On an expenditure side, what we're seeing is it's not usually a huge change for businesses, the way R&D expenditure is identified and tracked and captured and taken forward, but it's definitely is on an activity side. The other big change is, under the incentive is you won't get your R&D funding quarterly anymore in cash. It's delayed till when you lodge your tax return.
I'd just like to say something there, Andrew, that one of the things that we see in the figures, because R&D is really or spend is a symptom rather than an action in terms of a sign of confidence. And if you look at the TIN report this year, R&D spend grew by double digits, but we saw a tailing off in the growth of sales and marketing spend. And I guess that makes sense in terms of it's easier to trim your sales on any commercial activity, but if you've got a long-term project ongoing, that you're just not going to switch it off. It's got strategic value. The Verify, we're recruiting people, and we're looking to leverage the R&D loan to actually accelerate stuff. And I think one of the things that's been amazing in the TIN companies is how many companies have been positively affected by COVID-19. And so then you say, wow, are we spending enough? If we don't spend enough now, will we be able to exercise this opportunity? And so, I really think, this is just a crazy Irish view on the world, or half Irish view on the world, but really, I think we've got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity here in the country where the world's in chaos and we can live normal lives and focus on the things that matter for our business. And I kind of think that the world's ready for big plays. There's certainly a lot of money floating around looking for homes. So anyway, that's just a
Thanks, Greg. I'll just come back to that point. I just wanted to pick up Howard. Howard's put a question in. Thanks, Howard. We are talking about, I guess most of the businesses here would be classified certainly as medium-sized businesses, if not large. Tim, maybe I'll put this question to you. If you're a startup, looking at your business, looking at how you set up your R&D, looking at what funding opportunities are available, what recommendations have you got out there for a business like Howard's? Howard, maybe, I don't know if you can speak, Howard, maybe just describe what you're doing at the moment. Maybe it might be helpful.
Yeah, no problem. We're developing a information-based portal for executive search services. So looking at a range of information that we can capture across industries, companies and individuals across digital profiles. So we're developing a portal.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so it's interesting understanding the business to then aligning it to the different funding streams that are available. And something we haven't touched on to confuse the R&D funding piece even further is most of these programs we've talked through or mentioned today, they've all got different definitions of what R&D is. So the government's got at least 3, if not more, definitions of R&D, and they do vary quite significantly. The immediate available programs that are easiest to access are the programs like the tax-based programs, because they're entitlement programs. If you're entitled to them, you can access them. They're not competitive anyway. Where some of the grant programs are more discretionary and they're more competitive. Saying that, the grant, like the project grant, is an entitlement grant program. So if you meet the requirements, you should get funding through it. It's not like there's a limited pool of funding. So, excuse me, the easiest ones to access, it's a matter of aligning your R&D with effectively the benchmark of how technical it needs to be for each funding program. So like the R&D loss offset program, where you can cash out your R&D related losses. If an early stage company is in tax losses, that's a great program because it's an entitlement program, and it's got a very broad definition of R&D. So there's a real cash flow opportunity that's really easy there. Some of the grant programs like the project grant program from Callaghan, that's really beneficial because it can fund up to 40 cents in the dollar for up to $800,000 projects. So that's intended to be for earlier stage, earlier R&D type program of businesses dipping the toes into R&D for the first time. So a higher level of funding, 40 cents in the dollar, and you're able to access that and that's paid quarterly, but only once you've gone through the approval process and been approved. You can actually double dip some of these programs as well. So you can access the loss offset program, the cash out program, and a project grant program for some of the expenditure. So there's the ability to get 40 cents plus up to another 17 cents in the dollar. So 53 cents in the dollar back on R&D. So it's actually something that you do need to sit down and think about what you're doing, what's the right program for the business at that point in time. Each program has its own limits and requirements, but there's an exercise to go through to figure out what's appropriate for the company. And that does change as time goes and as the business matures.
Does that answer the question, Howard?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks. I guess I wanted to pick up on Greg's point. He kind of stole my thunder a little bit there, and talk about how does the funding or the availability of funding affect your R&D spending? Does it change how much you would? How does it change in what you're spending on? And I guess what would be the consequences if the funding wasn't available in New Zealand? So I think we'll maybe talk about what the different options would be. Graham, do you want to talk about that, about how the funding has changed your business?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll go back to a comment maybe even that Tim made. We were we're a relatively young company, and we were beneficiaries of, I think it was called Forced back at the time, of a grant in the very early days. We are now 88 times the size in revenue that we were at the time we received that grant. And you could very easily build the argument that we'd be nowhere near that size if we had not received that grant. So if you want to think about something of a retrospective and say, well, what's the benefit? You've got to look a long way forward, and we're that point forward now looking back. So I think that's abundantly clear. As we scale and get larger, clearly we have greater optionality. We have development centres in 4 locations around the world, and that gives us, in a sense, a degree of work and mobility. So that's always something you're thinking about. Does this kind of funding or R&D drive those decisions? No, it doesn't. It's a component of the business mix. Be that R&D tax credits, be it grant funding, but I would say that grant funding has simply enabled us to accelerate and get to the sort of scale we are. So I think that's a point on that piece. I do feel, and I'll just make a sort of slightly separate but related point, and then because we're going to close this call out pretty quick, I suspect. But in all of this discussion, if I can just add a sort of an overarching comment, I think there's a fundamental question, which is what's R&D and what is innovation? And it was interesting the Minister referred to innovation. Those two things do not necessarily intersect. And I think as it relates to R&D, in software, there's a big question about what is R&D. And happy to talk about that more, but I think we're completely unaligned about what is really R&D, what drives economic value versus definitionally how we're treating R&D in the sort of current environment. But I'll leave that there.
Tim, do you want to just build on that comment while I...
Yeah, and that probably sums up exactly where the conversation with the rollout of the tax incentive is at the moment. What is this program meant to be incentivising compared to some of the previous R&D programs or some of the other R&D programs? There are different definitions, they're being interpreted differently, but they have quite material implications and consequences on the businesses at the back end. So that's a very live discussion at the moment. And I know the minister's involved in that, and she does keep referring to innovation. She's mentioned that many times in her speeches over the last 12 months or more, that the R&D incentive is focused on innovation and incentivising innovation. We just need to see that practically work through in the practical application of the program. But that's right on point, Graham.
Don and Thibaut, do you want to comment on how the R&D funding has changed your business, or how it may have changed your business?
Yes, sure. We've got a very similar story than Graham, although I'm very impressed by the 88 increase in size. We haven't done that. But yeah, we were part of the FRST program, and we built from scratch a brand new product, a 3D monitoring system for material handling. And that's now our core product that we build everything on. So without FRST and then the project grant, we wouldn't be there, that's for sure. Now that we've grown, the funding is pretty much self-funding, and how much of the growth grant and the RTDI we can get is simply how much we can add to the R&D and compete internationally. We are providing services internationally, and all our competitors are from Europe or the US, and their capability to bring new R&D every year is just phenomenal. And to be able to compete, we need this sustained spending on R&D, and that's critical for us. It's really how we can compete internationally is key for us.
Cool. Nick, do you want to comment on how R&D's transformed, R&D funding's transformed DC?
Sure. So we actually went for a Callahan Innovation Project grant, but we have more than 50% shareholding overseas, which there's a little glitch in the process where you need those foreign shareholders to sign an indemnity to any funding that Callahan provide, and so that was a bit of a sticking block for us. So in terms of funding, we are largely self-funded from revenue, and without that revenue-based stream back into R&D, then we wouldn't be able to have the agility that we have at the moment, especially at this time where we're seeing this new life cycle of new products that we're trying to push through. In saying that, though, of course, we do take advantage of the tax incentive, which does mean that we can get roughly a 15% increase in what we're applying through the R&D, and also we've started to look at getting people like interns funded through Callahan Innovation, which also brings some fresh eyes to the work that we do. But I would say on the whole, for us, R&D is critical for where we are at the moment in terms of being agile enough to start looking at what these various new projects and various new partnerships are going to be for the new products going through DEC.
Thanks, Nick. Now I was going to ask a question about the, you heard Megan Woods talk about the loans, and they've been incredibly popular. I think there was a kind of a reference or an insinuation that they may be continued or maybe re-looked at again going forward. Now I don't think anyone on the call has had a loan, maybe except for Greg. So Greg, I was maybe going to, and I don't know if there's anyone else on the call that can add some perspective, but Greg, I was going to ask you whether you, how you found the loan, how does it work, and has it worked for you?
Awesome, thanks, Andrew. Look, we'll apply for any money that's going that will make us go faster, and so if someone wants to offer it, we'll take it. Swapping between project grants and the R&D tax loss credit, and that wasn't really kind of a big change for us at our size. I can't speak on what it means for bigger companies. For the loan, look, I have to say, over the COVID period, I've been incredibly impressed with the response by the whole country to the issue in terms of when we applied for wage subsidies for Verify, we got the money, the next day. I just couldn't believe how quick it was. When we approached banks for extensions of credit, took a long time to get through, and we deal with a number of banks, and once you got them on the phone, they couldn't be more helpful. It was really quite heartwarming. And the same with, so coming back to the loan, it's been awesome. We just wanted a bit more space to do some stuff and be at a point where we could raise more capital with more results. And so it was a pretty painless process. For Verify, it's kind of easier because we do nothing but R&D. So, how we spend that money is quite clear cut. But no, it wasn't this case of, oh God, why am I doing this? We've got to jump through so many hoops. It's not really worth my while. I should be doing other things. I wasn't doing it anyway, but it was certainly worth the effort. Andrew, we're at time for your summing up, so
okay. I will do that. Well, I think what's useful for me, and Tim, surely you jump in if you agree. It's really helpful to get insights from other people's businesses as to how they approach things. Because I think what tends to happen in New Zealand, depending where you're actually situated in New Zealand, you can sometimes work in isolation and not be aware of the issues and the opportunities that other businesses are facing. So for me, the most valuable part of this discussion is just hearing the insights from other people, understanding what they're going through, and kind of learning from it as well. So I guess that's what I get from it. Tim, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I can't agree more with that. Learning off each other, understanding that other people are on the same journey, aligning things at the right time. The government's got lots of funding streams, and it's just matching the right one to the right time for the business. And it's hard to keep aware of them all, but it can definitely add value.
Okay, so myself and if you'd like to reach out to myself or Tim, we're available in the EY booth, so feel free to do that. But Greg, I'll just pass over to you to close out.
Thanks, Tim. That's been very insightful, and so thanks for all your help for Verify. Over the period, I really enjoy working with you guys. Graham, Thibaut, Nick, Don, who have I missed? Nick, Thibaut, yeah, that's all. Well, I should be looking at the screen actually. Looking at my notes just at the side of the camera. Thanks for spending your time. Hopefully you've got something that was useful out today in the audience. A particular shout out to Honourable Dr. Megan Woods for making the time to be here today. I think the collaboration between business and government and the service agencies and service companies like EY that are supporting tech business is key. So the more we can share these ideas, the better. Now, the next session we've got today is the Raising Revolution, so new approaches to capital raising. It's a fireside chat between Leighton Roberts from Sharesies and Sarah Minhanick from NZX. So I don't